could strengthen into some of the models saying a major storm. It's going to have that that momentum to bring some big impacts far from the coast as well, as we've seen.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what's happening today. Obviously,
maybe a major hurricane, or really any hurricane in general that is large in size, that is strong, you're going to see that risk for surge, and especially when you're talking about some of that coastal area around the around Florida, around the Gulf Coast, because of that coastal shelf. So let's talk about what we're looking at here. A storm surge watch is typically issued when life-threatening inundation is possible within 48 hours. So you're going to get your kind of 2-day warning there when it is possible. Now, when it is expected within 36 hours, so we're getting a better handle on it, the time is winding down, that is when you see that storm surge warning issued. So it's important to know the difference between those, but to prepare accordingly. Now, in terms of the wave heights, as we see that kind of taking shape right now, but we don't have anything that is actually formed. So what's going to happen is we'll watch as this forms, as it gains strength, as it moves into the very warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. We're going to watch as those wave heights start to come up, and this is going to be a far-reaching impact. Look how far out these very high, very rough waves are going to be reaching up and down the west coast of Florida, all around the northern Gulf Coast as well. That is going to cause some coastal erosion. That is going to cause some of that flooding as well, and that storm surge that we're worried about. When you're talking about waves that large in this broad of an area, there are a lot of places that are going to be outside of the cone that are going to feel these impacts. So the wind strength plays a factor. What category storm do we have? The storms, as they get stronger, that increases our surge possibility. The force of pushing on that water, that wind energy that we get with a stronger storm makes a difference. And as little as 15 miles per hour in terms of those wind speeds can raise that storm surge risk by several feet. So that's why, when we're talking about Dr. Nab saying prepare for a category above the forecast, it is better safe than sorry. Also, the forward speed affects the amount of surge that you're going to get. We've talked about the shape of the coastline quite a bit there in the Gulf of Mexico, where you have that very steady slope for the west coast of Florida, for the northern Gulf Coast, and then you've got that concave or that kind of backward C shape there around the Big Bend region of Florida that acts as somewhat of a bowl to kind of collect that water. The faster storms also produce higher surge on open coasts. The slower storms produce higher surge on more closed coasts. The storm size also makes a difference. So there are a lot of different factors with this particular system, Dr. Nab, that we're going to have to watch before we get kind of those numbers in. But it is good to know right now, if you're in Florida, what is your evacuation zone?
Oh, that is a critical.
That's right. You want to know your zone in advance. You don't want to start to hear that places in your area are starting to evacuate, and you're saying, well, is that me? I don't know. And then you're trying to look it up and figure out what you should do. So let's get you through some of the preliminary steps, because as we've talked about so much, the window to prepare for this system is small because, we've been watching it for so long and trying to see what it was going to do. You want to make sure first and foremost that you're stocking enough water and essential medications. Make sure that you have that for your whole family as well. Plan your evacuation route. That's so important. Fill up the cars with gas. We've all seen it when a storm is approaching. I know those gas lines get really long, but better to have it. Wait in that line, be prepared, than to not have it. You want to prepare your first aid kit, your batteries, with your LED lights. Have maybe some of those solar powered lights. That is a great option as well. And then, of course, you've seen it many, many times with all of these storms. We prepare our homes with the plywood, with the hurricane shutters and all of that. Even more important than any of this is to know that evacuation zone and know if you need to leave. That is going to be so important. Know where you can shelter as well if maybe you don't feel safe staying in your home. Get those essential supplies for yourself, for your others, for your pets. Get the insurance, the flood coverage, all of that. Now, the flood coverage would take a while to kick in, so that's not going to help you immediately with this storm, but it's something to think about before the next one. If you have questions about this system or anything, go back into Weather Unfiltered. Felicia Combs, Mike Bettis here, and of course, as we've been expecting, we have a system that we have to watch really closely that will be moving into the Gulf.
So I feel like we've been talking about this for about a week or so now, right? But nothing is formed yet, honestly. Things, though, could really accelerate in the next 2 to 3 days, and we could be looking at a landfall by Thursday.
Yeah, we knew that if this system took the route of kind of jumping between the Yucatan and Cuba, or even kind of skimming the Yucatan Peninsula, that we would have a system in the Gulf, and it has to go somewhere.
Yeah, into the Gulf of Mexico usually means it's going to hit land. So our hurricane expert and former director of the National Hurricane Center, Dr. Rick Nab, is with us as well. Dr. Nab, when you think about what the forecast is, look several days, it's kind of taking that most efficient track into the Gulf of Mexico.
Unfortunately, it is, but there's a good reason why we've been talking about this for a week, because the setup, the pattern, the conditions are extremely conducive.
Convenience, what a luxury for us to have.
Yeah.
Nonstop flights basically at this point through landfall, which is going to give us such invaluable information.
Yeah, and you know, I know it's not the most time that you have to prepare for a storm, but you still have a couple days that you can get prepared, you can make your decisions, and you don't want to wait until the last minute.
No, you really don't. And here's a look at that forecast, by the way. So today's a decent day. I mean, it's a warm day.
Yeah.
So, you know, plan appropriately for the heat, but these are all the places from Pensacola back down through South Florida where you should have mainly dry weather. That could change for us tomorrow, especially the farther south you go.
Yeah, you see tomorrow's still going to remain hot, but you'll still have time to get those kind of last-minute preparations ready, whether it's the hurricane shutters, picking up the supplies, whatever you might be doing, or making your decision about what you're going to do for this storm.
You start seeing some of the outer bands first. That could come in as early as Wednesday. On Thursday, you can see where the center will be. And then again, could be anywhere from the Panhandle to West Florida. We don't know right now exactly where the center is going to go. So truly everywhere from Tampa to Panama City or Pensacola, we need to be expecting a landfall.
And what you could see from those rain bands is that they are far reaching. And we know that all it takes is, you know, one rain band to set up well inland, raining over the same area over and over again. And you've got a terrible flash flooding problem well inland even.
It certainly could happen. There's no doubt about that. You look at some of these rainfall totals, they're big. Now, again, an accelerating storm is better than a slow moving one, but still you can see the swath of heavy rain could be 5 to 8 inches in spots.
Yeah. Well, if you have, you know, I think we've both been in this long enough that we have sat and watched storms rapidly intensify. And, you know, maybe that wasn't initially part of the forecast, but then that's what we're seeing happen. And all of a sudden, people who stayed behind are wishing, man, I wish I would have left. So I'm so glad that we're talking about this so much now.
And the Hurricane Center is explicitly forecasting rapid intensification from Tuesday evening into Wednesday evening. So this is a new era of intensity forecasting where in some cases we have a lot more confidence when the upper level wind shear is going to be weak and you've got this much fuel to tap into. And this is a notorious zone going from the Northwest Caribbean through the eastern Gulf of Mexico. And that's why the models are so gung-ho, unfortunately, about this getting close to or at major hurricane strength. But look at how in the last 6 years, it's been almost an annual occurrence to go from Northwest Caribbean tropical storm to landfalling major, including Idalia last year.
It doesn't take much to know that once it gets in the Gulf of Mexico, it has to hit land at some point to get out. And as we know, especially in recent years, the Gulf of Mexico has so much heat content. It's not just about, you know, that surface level heat, but the heat reaching very far down, which allows those storms to just thrive. And that's what we've seen from many of these storms that have gotten into that Gulf of Mexico.
So
from the Northwest
3 days
Caribbean.
is more than enough time to go from tropical storm to landfalling major. But Idalia showed us last year, you don't even have to have the landfall of the center, because you had this strong hurricane going west of Tampa and Clearwater. Clearwater still got storm surge flooding. What if this goes farther to the right and directly hits Tampa? What if it goes farther left than Michael and is on the other side of Panama City Beach? We could have a new place that has their hurricane of record.
Still a lot to watch with this forecast. And of course, if you have questions, send it to us.
Right now on Weather Unfiltered, potential tropical cyclone 9 heading into the Gulf of Mexico this week, could be moving quickly and could become a major hurricane, and today is a day to start getting ready.
That's right. Watches and warnings are up for parts of the Caribbean, and we should expect the same for the U.S. later today or tomorrow. Now, this storm will bring extreme wind, flooding rain, and storm surge. And even if you're not in the cone, as we know, you still need to prepare.
Indeed you do. So welcome in, everyone. You're watching Weather Unfiltered. I'm Mike Bettis.
I'm Felicia Combs, along with our hurricane expert and former director of the National Hurricane Center, Dr. Rick Knabb. We're breaking it all down from, you know, what we are still figuring out with where this might go to where all we need to prepare. There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, and if you're asking yourself when you look at that cone, seriously, this could go from not even a depression to a major hurricane in 3 days. But as we're going to show and discuss, we've seen this play out before. It's almost becoming an annual occurrence over the last 5 to 6 years. Northwest Caribbean tropical storm to U.S. major hurricane in the Gulf in 3 days.
It can happen in a blink of an eye, and before you know it, you may be caught unprepared, right? So today is a great day to prepare. Tomorrow should be a good day to prepare as well, because as this thing eventually moves into the Gulf of Mexico, it accelerates, gets more intense. So while it's now in the Caribbean, this is the time.
That's right. And of course, as we know, it's going to be much easier, or not easier to forecast, but we'll have a better handle on that forecast once something is actually formed. But the hurricane hunters have been in there investigating, and it's still, as you can see, it's looking a little healthier clear, but it's still messy.
That's a really important point, Felicia, is the data show that when it's not yet even a depression or storm, the track forecasts are less accurate because we don't really know where the center is and it's still forming. And so if you are on the edge of the cone or just outside the cone right now, you are not out of the woods here, and this forecast could definitely change.
You know, finding that center could be very key in all of this, and that's why we rely on the hurricane hunters to try to find that
coast, you know, up and down that coastal region, the northern Gulf Coast, wrapping around the west coast of Florida. You know how to keep a close eye on that risk for storm surge. So let's break it down for you. What you need to be watching as we head toward the system making landfall, toward it becoming more of, you know, a pinpointed storm there in the Gulf in the next couple days. A storm surge watch is when you have the possibility of life-threatening storm surge inundation within 48 hours, so within the next 2 days. So you'll start to see those storm surge watches going up first. Now, when that switches to a storm surge warning, that means that storm surge is expected within the next 36 hours. That means that time to prepare or evacuate, if you need to evacuate, is winding down, and that's why we say keep a very close eye on this. We do know that as the system gets its act together, we will see it churning up the Gulf, and that is going to lend itself to those storm surge possibilities. We're seeing some of those waves at this buoy here, you know, well removed from the center, 3 to 5 feet, but we're starting to see those wave heights come up right now, and that is going to be even more of the story as this system gets its act together and moves into those abundantly warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. This is just the fuel that a system needs when you're talking about the warm water that we have, the environment that we're going to have. So watch what happens as we're heading into Wednesday evening. We're really seeing those waves come up, and how that translates to you. If you're looking at this and you're like, you know, well, what does the wave height translate to me? When you have waves this big offshore with a system like this, it is that much more wind energy pushing that storm surge. Those waves are large. You're talking about coastal erosion. You're talking about coastal flooding. You're talking about the energy of those waves being able to push farther inland, and that's why we're concerned about this. The wind strength, that is going to be one of the factors that we look at for surge. Stronger storms increase that push of water, Dr. Nab. And then when we're looking at some of these winds that we're talking about, maybe approaching major storm force winds, you know that results in that higher storm surge totals being possible for this region.
evacuation zone is pretty vital.
That's right. It's one of the most important things that you could be doing right now to prepare. The last thing that you want to do is, you know, hear that evacuations are starting and then be rushing to find out, am I in this evacuation zone, or not know your zone at all? So what you can do in Florida is go to floridadisaster.org to find out your evacuation zone. That's how we do it. You know, it's not going to just be this entire area evacuate. It's going to be done by zones, and those zones are they are laid out very specifically, very scientifically for the risk. So you want to know your zone and know if you are being told to evacuate. Here's what we're looking at. Here's Thursday afternoon. We've got the system fully churning in the Gulf of Mexico, and it is churning up very, very large waves. That is going to translate into that wave energy coming up against our beaches, into coastal erosion, into storm surge problems, and that's what we're going to be dealing with as this system traverses through the Gulf of Mexico. So this is what you want to do if you are preparing for a possible evacuation. As we just mentioned, know your evacuation zone. If you are in a high-rise in the storm surge evacuation zone, you still want to know that. Any structure is unsafe in very, very strong winds. We say that you want to run from the water and hide from the wind, but you know, when you're getting to a major hurricane, you might not want to be in a high-rise with all glass windows, right? That's not going to feel very safe. If you're in a mobile home near the coast, you will likely need to evacuate, or even inland. We can see those winds get very dangerous, and you'll notice that it is the outstretching field of wind. Into Weather Unfiltered, Felicia Combs, Mike Bettis, and we have all eyes on what will be Helene in the Gulf of Mexico.
So it's called potential tropical cyclone number 9 right now. I think it's well on its way to becoming a hurricane. I think the forecast, you know, high-end Cat 2, low-end Cat 3 hurricane is going to be likely in the next 3 days.
Yeah, it's something for us to watch really closely. You know, one of the things that I want to underscore right now, and I think we've been talking about it a lot, is there's not a center of circulation yet. The hurricane hunters are in there investigating this system. So right now, while there is a cone out, while we're seeing some of those forecast products, there's still so much to watch.
There is. There's a lot of time to prepare, though.
Yeah.
Today's a great day. Tomorrow is a good day as well, because Dr. Nab, what's coming down the pike here, very dangerous, especially if we're talking potential major hurricane hitting Florida.
And if you don't believe it can go from near depression to major hurricane at landfall in the Gulf in 3 days, all you have to do is look at history. Idalia,
Time to prepare is now. It's paramount that you are ready for when this thing hits. If you take a look at the forecast, today, weather-wise, calm, hot, calm though. So today's the day to prepare.
Yeah, I mean, you expect it to be kind of hot this time of year anyways. At least you're not dodging the rain constantly. Tomorrow, another one of those days. Now, you will have a better chance at a little bit of rain across portions of South Florida, but still hot and a fantastic day to get out there and prepare tomorrow, because it's not going to be long before we start to see those rain bands moving through heading into Wednesday and Thursday.
That could happen as early as, say, Wednesday morning in South Florida, places like Naples and Fort Myers, and then it only gets more intense as we go through Wednesday evening and then overnight on Thursday. Here you can see where the center of circulation is going to be by early Thursday before you even wake up, then making its way potentially anywhere between Tampa, Apalachicola, Tampa, Panama City.
Yeah, as you're looking at this, you may say, oh, well, there will be plenty of breaks in between those rain bands. I'll have time. But if you've ever been caught in a rain band, you know you want to avoid being out in that at all costs. You want to get it all done in the next couple days when it's completely dry.
The winds get really intense, and you could even run the risk of a tornado or two that's touching down in some of those outer bands, not to mention the heavy rain that will accompany the entire system from Florida all the way up through the southeast.
Yeah, those rain bands are going to be far-reaching. When you're talking about a system that is going to be strong and it's going to be out over that warm water being fueled by the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, it is going to have that capability to take that power and that moisture and wring it out far away from the center.
It really will. Yeah. So heavy amounts of rain here. European models a little bit farther east, GFS models a little bit farther to the west, and the GFS a little bit farther to the east here. But ultimately, be prepared across the southeast for some flooding rain.
Yeah, it is going to continue into Friday, early Saturday as well for a large area inland.
It will indeed. All right, so if you...
What we expect to become, Helene, may join a list of notorious Gulf of Mexico storms, ones that rapidly intensified. Alex Wilson has more on what that means. And of course, Dr. Knabb, as we've mentioned, as we pointed out, it is actually forecast to rapidly intensify when you look at the forecast from the National Hurricane Center.
It's not every day that before it's even a depression, the Hurricane Center explicitly forecasts rapid intensification from Tuesday evening to Wednesday evening with more strengthening after that point. But we've seen this play out before with Northwestern Caribbean tropical storms within 3 days being major hurricanes at landfall, and it's almost an annual occurrence in the central to eastern Gulf of Mexico.
And with those storms just intensifying so quickly, one thing that the models do have a hard time with, and that's why we say, you know, be prepared for this, is the models can only go off those historical factors. So when you're talking about maybe anomalously warm Gulf waters with a heat content that's really deep, the models aren't necessarily going to factor that in as well.
Right. You have statistical models that kind of learn from the past. You do have some dynamical models that are more increasingly trying to explicitly forecast this sort of thing, but all of these hurricanes, we didn't know exactly where they were going to make landfall when it was down in the Northwestern Caribbean. So could it be some location that hasn't had the direct impact from one of these major hurricanes in the last 5-6 years that gets unlucky this time? Yeah. So don't think it can't happen to you.
The time to prepare is now. If you have more questions, you can send them to us on social media. Use the hashtag #HurricaneQuestion.
Hour of Weather Unfiltered. Potential tropical cyclone 9 heading to the Gulf of Mexico this week. Could move quickly and become a major hurricane. Today is a day to get ready.
That's right. Watches and warnings are up for parts of the Caribbean, and we should expect the same for the U.S. later today or tomorrow. Now, this storm will bring extreme wind, flooding, rain, and storm surge. And even if you're not in the cone, as we know, you still need to be getting prepared.
Yes, so important to learn from the lessons of past storms about how to deal with the cone and not misinterpret it. First, don't assume it's going to go down the middle of the cone. Could go left side, could go right side. And I really get worried about the entire Gulf Coast of the Florida Peninsula with storm surge, even if you're outside the cone. We learned that in Ian.
We have, and you look at the area that could be affected. It could be Panama City. It could be anywhere between Panama City and Tampa. Yeah. And you think about the orientation of that cone, because you're basically making a right angle in essence. You know, where it goes by just a few miles makes a big difference.
And we could have evacuation, possibly evacuation level storm surge way outside the cone down the Gulf Coast of the peninsula, because that area is so vulnerable.
Yeah, I have a feeling it's going to be, you know, you see your impacts where it makes landfall, but this is going to be one of those storms where we likely have far-reaching impacts well away from where it makes landfall, and that's what we need you to prepare for.
All right, so let's talk.
Which is into places where you typically would not have water. So you start to see that storm surge inundation becoming a big part of the forecast of the problem for our coastal areas. Let's break down a storm surge watch versus storm surge warning so you know what you're dealing with, because storm surge watches will be issued about 48 hours within the possibility of life-threatening storm surge inundation. And then when we start to see that storm surge warning going up, that means we've got about 36 hours. That is when we're expecting that possibility, or the storm surge warning means it is expected. So not really even a possibility anymore, but we're expecting that storm surge when you see that warning. So you want to be prepared and know the forecast ahead of time. Starting to see some of those waves coming up there in the Western Caribbean, but what we're expecting as the system moves to the Gulf of Mexico over that just fuel of those warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, of the really conducive forecast for strengthening, we'll see those waves getting higher and higher. And of course, you know that wave energy, it emanates out from the center. So you've got a far-reaching region of the impacts of these waves. I mean, when you're starting to see those waves come up all the way from, you know, Mobile Bay all the way down into the Keys, you're seeing much of the Gulf Coast impacted by this rough water, by this impact of these very high waves. And then, of course, that lends itself to that possibility of storm surge flooding, of coastal erosion, of impacting those homes that are very close to the beach. So when you're talking about the factors that when you look at that forecast for storm surge, stronger storms are going to increase that possibility of that wind energy on the water, because that's what storm surge is. It's a translation of the wind energy on the water, translates into that flooding. So when you have a stronger storm with higher winds, that is going to translate into higher surge in a lot of cases. Just a 15-mile-per-hour difference can result in much higher surge. And look at these winds that we're expecting. I mean, Key West, not anywhere in the cone, but 50, 60-mile-per-hour wind gusts there. Over to the east coast of Florida, Miami, Vero Beach, it's all about that wind direction, that wind duration. And when you're talking about a very strong storm impacting this area, there's so much real estate, so many large cities, and when you're looking at that forecast for those hurricane strength force winds over 90 miles per hour in Cedar Key, you're looking at that possibility for those storm surge numbers going up, especially with the type of coast that we have there in the Gulf Coast. Also, that forward speed makes a difference. You know, Dr. Nab, we never want to see a very slow moving system, but when you have a fast moving system as well, it helps to produce that higher storm surge on those open coasts.
And all of those factors are amplified.
As you're preparing, you want to make sure that you know your evacuation zone. It is so important that you're not, you know, guessing at this, and you can check it so easily. You can check it right now before anything is happening, before you need to make any big decisions. You can go to floridadisaster.org to know your zone, to know your evacuation zone, know if you need to be evacuating, and then of course keeping a close eye on this forecast. Here's the current forecast Thursday afternoon. This is the wave height forecast. So when you're seeing getting into those bright pinks, you're getting up there around 20, 30 foot waves. And as we know, that wave energy translates up against the coastal areas. That translates into storm surge flooding. It translates into coastal erosion. So many different issues that we're going to have from this strong system being there in the Gulf. Now, the possibility of an evacuation is always there, especially if you live near the coast. But there are other reasons that you might need to evacuate. If you live in, say, a mobile home, whether you're at the coast or inland, the winds can become very dangerous. If you're in a mobile home, of course, we have more vulnerable populations, as in nursing homes, and then those high rises can become a big issue with strong winds as well.
They definitely.
Weather Unfiltered, where we are keeping all eyes on what is forecast to be our next named storm, Helene. Yeah, and into the Gulf of Mexico, expecting a wide area of impacts out of this system.
It could be a doozy. There's no question about that. Forecasting some rapid intensification, forecast for a landfall potentially by Thursday, forecasting a major hurricane potentially.
Yeah, there are going to be a lot of people impacted by this well outside of the cone. Thanks for sticking with us here. Felicia Combs, Mike Bettis. We are kind of breaking down all the possibilities right now of a forecast that is still really in its infancy, that we've got to keep a very close eye on as the system kind of gets its circulation together and the models get a better grip on where they want to take it.
And it's always, you know, the closer we get to the event itself and the landfall, the easier it is to narrow it down. But the models are starting to come into some agreement here, Dr. Nab, as for a Florida landfall as potentially Cat 2, Cat 3 somewhere in there. So we've got to be ready for this.
And you can't even rule out something stronger. We've known from history that 3 days is enough time to go from a tropical storm in the north.
Watch and that forecast, something to keep a very close eye on. Now, what we expect to become Helene may join a list of notorious Gulf of Mexico storms, ones that rapidly intensified. Alex Wilson has more on what that means. Just looking at those images, Dr. Nab, you know, it brings back those memories, I'm sure, to so many people who watched a storm go from a tropical storm or a Cat 1 very quickly to a major hurricane and then left images like we just saw on that.
And those memories are way too recent. You know,
So
I feel like, oh, but do we have to deal with this again? Right. But unfortunately, this is almost becoming an annual occurrence to have storms form here in the Northwest Caribbean and then be landfalling major hurricanes in the U.S. on the Gulf Coast. But it's because of the deep warm water over the Northwest Caribbean and the Eastern and Central Gulf. It's just a notorious region. And when the atmosphere is cooperating, look at that upper level outflow starting to take shape. And this trough is only going to enhance the outflow channel to the north. Watch how this upper level pattern evolves that allows the storm to kind of breathe and ventilate. It's probably not going to get sheared apart. So this is a scenario that looks a lot like some of these past notorious storms just within the last 6 years.
You know, as you look at this graphic, you can see so many of those storms, maybe not necessarily originating right here, but passing over this region, ending up in the Gulf. And, you know, I think you could look at any one of these names and think about how strong those storms got and the far-reaching impacts well outside of landfall.
Yeah, and the bottom line is even if they formed farther east, they were still tropical storms in some portion of the Northwest Caribbean, went tropical storm to landfalling 3, 4, or 5 in just 3 days. It's almost happened every year since 2018.
More than enough time, more than enough ingredients for that.
Headed into the Gulf of Mexico this week. It'll end up moving pretty quickly too and could become a major hurricane, and today is a day to prep.
That's right. Watches and warnings are up already for parts of the Caribbean, and we should expect the same for the U.S. later today or tomorrow. Now, this storm is going to bring extreme wind, flooding, rain, and storm surge. And even if you're not in the cone, as we've seen many times, you still need to get prepared.
Yeah, so many lessons learned from past eastern Gulf of Mexico major hurricanes in the last few years. We've been doing this a lot. So we're becoming really skilled at it, right? So let's apply those skills. Don't assume it's going to go right down the middle of the cone, and don't assume that all the impacts from wind and water are going to stay within the cone. You could have storm surge, strong winds, severe weather well outside that cone in Florida.
Yeah, you can see what's going on behind us here on the maps. You can see we already have the watches and warnings in effect. You see that cone that makes a zigzag here, but Florida's squarely within it.
Yeah, I would be getting prepared in Florida. And, you know, it is not always a product of where it's making landfall. You get those onshore winds on even the East Coast for quite some time, the East Coast part of Florida, and you're feeling those impacts. It's going to be far-reaching, but we're breaking it all down for you.
All right, so a lot to cover for you. Let's talk a little bit more detail here about PTC 9.
Just keeps coming, and it can add up in a big way, as we've seen, you know, but even just the smallest amount of water, you know, you get 3 inches in your home or in your business, and you know how much damage that can do. So let's break this down for you, because we'll likely start to see some of this coming up soon with the storm surge watches. When you have a storm surge watch issued, it means that life-threatening inundation from that rising water is possible within the next 48 hours. You can see the highlighted word possible there. 48 hours is our timing on that. With a storm surge warning, that means that storm surge is expected within the next 36-hour period. You really want to make sure that you're watching that and being prepared, especially along the coast with that. Now, we've watched as some of these wave heights have come up from 3 to 5 feet up to 4 to 6 feet now as the system's getting its act together. And this is what we're expecting as it moves into the Gulf of Mexico and strengthens. Those wave heights will just keep climbing. And you know, what is a wave? It is that wind energy. It is just energy. And as we know, you know, simple physics, energy can't be created or destroyed. It just has to be transferred. So when that is in the form of wave energy, it's transferring itself into coastal erosion, into that water pushing farther inland, into storm surge flooding. And that's what we're going to be dealing with these very large waves, very rough times in the Gulf of Mexico. Wind strength is one of the factors that we look to forecast that storm surge potential. A stronger storm, maybe a major hurricane, hurricane is going to have even more potential of pushing that water, of forcing it inland. Even just 15 miles per hour difference in the wind speed can make a big difference. And as Mike just showed you, we are expecting some very strong winds really around this system. And Dr. Knapp, it's not just within that cone or within the immediate landfall area. We could see those storm surge implications for many coasts far away from where it makes landfall.
Oh, absolutely.
All very important tips there, and one of the most important is to know your zone. We say this with every storm that could bring us some evacuations. If you're in Florida, go to floridadisaster.org. You want to know if you live in an evacuation zone, and if you do, what area that is or how it's labeled, whether it be letter or number, so that when officials are calling for the evacuation of, say, Zone B, you know they are talking to you and you know you need to get out. You don't need to question that. When we see evacuation orders issued, they are issued for a reason. As we look at the forecast here, these are the forecast wave heights. This is Thursday afternoon, so as the system is strengthening within the Gulf, and all of that wave energy is going to translate itself into the possibility of coastal erosion, storm surge flooding, and of course you don't want to be around if you're talking about feet of that storm surge flooding. It gets dangerous very quickly. So when you're planning for that possible evacuation, again, if you think or know that you're in a likely storm surge evacuation zone, you want to go ahead and start thinking about that. Even a high rise in the storm surge evacuation zone, it's not always about like, oh, I made it through and I'm fine and my home didn't flood. It's about what are you going to be dealing with for weeks afterward, maybe with flooding hanging around or with those power outages. Any structure that is unsafe to strong winds. So if you live in a mobile home, even if you are well inland, you want to take that into consideration and figure out where you might be evacuating to. The area of tropical storm and hurricane force winds can extend, as you see here. This is the forecast for Thursday afternoon. Well outside of that cone, we're still going to be refining where exactly we think landfall will be and how far reaching those winds will be. But persistent tropical storm force winds can do some damage. They can bring down trees, can cause many power outages. So you just want to think about that as you're making your decision whether you're going to stay or find somewhere else to ride out the storm. In terms of the hurricane winds, we say run from the water and then seek shelter from the wind. And a lot of us are going to be dealing with those very strong hurricane force winds, but even those tropical storm force winds themselves pack a punch and can do damage. Back into Weather Unfiltered, Felicia Combs, Mike Bettis. We are keeping our eye on when that next a bit of information comes out with the hurricane hunters being in what is forecast to be Helene, collecting that latest data.
Yeah, what will we get at the 5 o'clock advisory?
Right.
Will it just be status quo? Will we get a tropical depression out of this? Are we going to get a name out of this, sooner than later? We don't know those details just yet, but we're anticipating that Helene is going to happen sooner than later.
Regardless of a name or when we get it or what's happening, we are seeing some indications in this forecast that now is when you probably want to start getting prepared, especially anywhere in the cone, but even a bit outside of the cone as well if you know you're in a storm surge prone place.
So let's get over to our hurricane expert and former director of the National Hurricane Center, Dr. Rick Knapp, for what could be a quick fuse event here, Dr. Knapp, where you only have now to Thursday to prep for this, and it's nothing right now, so people may be taking their eye off it. Depending on the coastline, the orientation of the coastline, how many people are living, right at the water's edge, it could be, pretty serious situation for some.
We say it every single time. Every storm is different. So if you're sitting here and you're like, oh, the past 5 that we were worried about have been a dud, that does not mean you want to get complacent with this one. And you've got great weather for the most part across this region to get prepared today.
Yeah, tomorrow, no different. It's going to be warm, of course. So, make sure you're taking those breaks. You're putting up, boards and shutters and all those kind of things, or grabbing, loose items from your yard. But eventually, as we get into late tomorrow, especially into Wednesday and Thursday, then you're going to run out of time. Yeah,
you don't want to be boarding up those windows. You don't even want to be, rushing to the grocery store, sitting in line for gas when these rain bands are lifting through, because they might be quick and fast moving, but they can have some of those weak spin up tornadoes. They can have some terrible winds in them that you just don't want to have to be out in that.
No, you really don't. Here we go. It's lunchtime on Thursday, and we're getting a lash in Florida from the west coast up through the Panhandle here in anticipation, at least with the current track, of a landfall somewhere around the Big Bend area. And of course, that's where we have the likeliest for the heavy rain and the flooding. Yeah,
this is going to be a far-reaching storm with its impacts, so you want to get prepared. The cone is there for reference. It's not there as a guardrail. Well, what we expect to become Helene may join a list of notorious Gulf of Mexico storms, ones that rapidly intensified. Alex Wilson has more on what that means. And of course, as we look at this, Dr. Nab, the ocean heat content here, I think our eyes immediately go to all the warmth that you have in the Caribbean, but then also that little nose right in the path that edges up into the Gulf of Mexico.
And unfortunately, the atmosphere is cooperating too with upper level high pressure and outflow that's going to follow the storm along. Even this trough to the north is going to help the storm intensify by enhancing the upper level outflow. So that fuel, along with the atmospheric conditions being very conducive, look at how the spin just gets really focused even before it gets to the Gulf of Mexico. And that's why the Hurricane Center is explicitly forecasting rapid intensification from a tropical storm tomorrow evening to a Cat 2 by Wednesday evening.
Yeah, and you can see that the atmosphere is moving this quickly. We're talking about, from tomorrow into landfall on Thursday. So you want to start making those preparations as soon as you can, especially when you're talking about a storm that is forecast to rapidly intensify.
Yeah, and so if you don't believe a system can go from a tropical storm tonight to a major hurricane landfall on the Gulf Coast of the U.S. in 3 days, look at how often that has happened in the last 6 years. It's almost an annual occurrence.
I would say just about it is. And we've seen many of these storms really get their act together very close to land. So you want to prepare for the worst.